Welcome, AP Psychology students, to day 2 of distance learning. If you have not done so already, please go to the classroom, open up the packet for day 2. You'll notice it's like super fancy edition. I had time over break, and be prepared to answer the do now questions. So I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes to answer those do now questions. They are multiple choice, and you're going to respond in that right-hand column with what your answer is and a little bit of justification on why that is correct. Don't feel pressured to go back afterwards and like change your answers to make it look like you knew more. Just to be totally honest with what you knew and didn't know. It's going to help me plan for you guys in the future. So go ahead and pause this video now and come back in 5 minutes. All right. Welcome back. Going to go through the debrief on these questions. First one, so which of the following studies would benefit most from a double-blind procedure? So first we need to know what a double-blind procedure is. That is any sort of experimental design, must be experimental, where neither the researcher nor the participant knows whether they are in the control group or the experimental group. So we need a couple of different conditions for the double-blind procedure to make sense. The first one is it needs to be an experiment. So I'm going to look through some of my answer choices here. A is a comparative study of IQ scores in different education systems. You can pretty much nix that one right away because it's purely a correlational study, which is not experimental. It's the other kind of research. B, you can't prescribe a family relationship like you're going to be loving and you're not going to be loving. So that one gets nixed. I'm going to skip on down to E because that's a pretty easy one to get rid of as well, because that one is also a survey, which is by design a correlational research method. So that leaves us between C and D. And the reason why D is the best answer is because you have two groups of people. Note that C involves rats. And you have researchers that are potentially interested in a certain outcome over another. You'll find that with double-blind procedures, they are most commonly used for things like treatments or whether a certain medication works or not. And the big risk here is that if I run a drug company and I say, hey, look, like my medication helps reduce the schizophrenic symptoms that my patients are experiencing, I should get $1 billion for this. Like that could be a conflict of interest. So double-blind procedures are absolutely the best method you can use if you're using medications or treatments. So that was kind of another way you could have come to that answer. Two. So this one asks about kind of variables, like what kind of variable is this? Sets up an example where two groups are presented. One is experimental and one is the control. And the question asks, in the study, the THC used can be described as, the answer is B, independent variable. So the way you remember this is that the independent variable is kind of like the condition that you were setting up in which the two different groups can respond, and the dependent variable is that response. So in this case, the dependent variable would be their ability to drive safely around the driving course would be the dependent variable, however they chose to measure that. 3. So this kind of piggybacks off that earlier question. And the research team is concerned that their results will not be generalizable. In order to address the concern, researchers should aim to, the answer is C, use random selection. So in order to answer this question, you need to know two pieces of information. The first one is what does it mean to be generalizable? And the next one is what does it mean to randomly select? So generalizability is the extent to which your sample, so like your group of people that you are testing, mirrors the real population that you are studying, right? So how representative is your sample? And the best way to do that is through random selection. So random selection occurs when you are first setting up your experiment and you're trying to recruit participants. And you usually use nowadays like a computer algorithm that will randomly call people or ask them to respond to your research request huge groups of people. And nowadays you can have research studies that are like nationwide, and they just randomly pick people and give them a call. Let's see. Yeah, that's the best way to do it. I mean, convenient sampling is probably like the anti-example for this. So convenient sampling is when you, for ease, convenience, use the people in your study who are all around you. So maybe you are a doctor and you're like, hey, cool, I want to see if this new treatment works well. I'm going to recruit 100 of my closest friends who are also all doctors to evaluate my treatment method. I'm going to use them as my research group. That tends to be the least generalizable because most of your contacts, the people that you're getting from a very small, easy space, tend to fall into a very small demographic group. B, while useful, doesn't really do anything on the like front end. So it'd be better to do a random selection procedure than to go back afterwards and be like, oh yeah, you know, like what was our demographics? Were we representative or not? D, single blind research study doesn't really apply. Single blind, by the way, is when the researcher knows who is an experimental and control participant, but the actual participant does not. Survey method doesn't really make sense here either. That doesn't really address how generalizable or how you're actually getting people into that sample at all. All right, 4. This one sets up a condition where researchers have noticed that children who have encyclopedias in their house earn higher grades, but the conclusion that encyclopedias cause grades to be higher is erroneous because, one second, addressing barking dog, because they've actually failed to differentiate between causation and correlation. So remember that causation, you have to have, number one, experiment. And in this case, it clearly says that this is a survey. It's noticing two different variables and if they're related to each other or not. And it's inferring that this presence of an encyclopedia actually caused them to be smarter. So they basically mixed up that. So this is a fancy way of asking about causation. It's not, you know, caused by two randomly observed variables. Correlation does not equal causation is a better way to say that. Next question. 5. So 5, this one asks a couple of things. The first part of this question deals with figuring out whether there is a causation or correlation relationship, and also for a correlation, what direction that relationship is. So survey says that people with higher levels of empathy do not enjoy violent humor as much as people with lower levels of empathy. So the first thing I have to do is I have to figure out that this is a correlation. We're not anything to do with causes or leading, so you can kind of axe out A and B. Remember, if you see survey, you should instantly be like, that's a correlation study. So A and B are out. So what we're left with are these 3 answers that deal with directionality. So when I say that 2 things are negatively correlated, what I mean is that as one variable increases, so levels of empathy, the other variable decreases. So if you were to plot it out, it would be a nice line down in the negative direction. Alternatively, D is the opposite. So D, if it's a positive correlation, would say as one variable increases, the other one increases as well. From the prompt, we can see that the answer is clearly C, that people with higher levels of empathy tend to enjoy the violent humor less. Good job, guys. Do now. So we're going to move ahead with our kind of new content for today. I'll let you guys know now that we are going to be mostly working with the psych research terminology this class, and we're going to be doing that with a practice FRQ. Pretty basic agenda. We're really only doing one review activity today because it is that longer FRQ. The last part of the class is going to be like a debrief, and then again, you guys have a mastery check in Edulastic. Okay, so framing for this, let you guys read that for a second. Once again, if you have not located that frequently found terms on AP Psych exams in the Google Classroom, I'd go back and look at it. It's a very cool resource to kind of guide you or give you like an inside scoop on which terms AP kind of ranks as the most important research terms. Okay, But before we get started with that, I want to go over some of those terms, the ones that were most likely to be coded red, which was I wasn't really sure what it was, so I looked it up. And the top three were illusory correlation, percentile rank, and face validity. I'm going to kind of go through a general gist of what those terms are and then give you an example. In your guys' packet, you have a space to take some brief notes, just like seriously be brief. And then over in that rightmost column, you have a little spot where you can record some sort of mnemonic or like a trick for you guys to remember that piece of information. So the first one is an illusory correlation. And when I think of illusory, I think of the word illusion. And the gist of this one is that it's when someone perceives a relationship to exist between two variables when there really isn't one. My favorite example of this is with like full moons. Even up to this day and for a lot of history, a good number of people believe that on full moons, people were more likely to be reckless or violent or crazy. Even up until recently, a lot of healthcare professionals believe that ERs or police stations would be a lot more busy on these full moon days, even if that's not true in that actual ER. That's where the word like lunatic comes from. Luna, moon, cool. Things that lead to an illusory correlation. The first one would be when two variables kind of occur together. So remember that humans love to find reasons for things. We're usually not satisfied with a correlation. We like to know the exact cause. So if in our brains we can figure out, this is what's causing this, we kind of regain a sense of control, and it's a lot more comfortable for our brains to be in that state. So in this example, maybe there was one day when the nurse was like, oh my gosh, this ER is just off the chain. Like, what could have caused this? And then, somebody else says, well, it's a full moon, right? And so because those two variables are occurring together, they form some sort of connection in that person's mind, and they kind of passed around and create through either anecdote or personal experience this like fake correlation. It's kind of like bias. It's kind of like research bias. And it definitely does make its way into research. We find that studies where like an illusory correlation is supported are a lot less scrutinized, which means that people are a lot more likely to just kind of accept that that conclusion is true because it kind of fits with their pre-existing knowledge. Second term is percentile rank. So percentile rank is basically the proportion of scores in a distribution. So there has to be a number of scores for this to work. That a specific score is greater than or equal to. Most of the time we see these things pop up as part of like a testing scheme. So on something like the state exams or the PARCC tests that you guys took on junior year for science, you get like a percentile rank. So say Ian scored in the 75th percentile on his AP practice test. What that number actually means, the only thing it means, is that his score is greater than or equal to 75% of the other scores. I think the biggest misrepresentation of this is that it's the actual percentage he got on the test. It does not mean he got a 75% on the test. He could have gotten an A. He could have gotten 80%, 90%. Doesn't matter as far as percentile rank is concerned, because percentile rank is just a point of comparison. Okay? And the last term is face validity. And this one's kind of tricky. So bear with me. It's basically the degree to which some sort of test that you're designing appears, that means on the surface, like at face value, appears to measure the variable or construct that it is supposed to measure. So a bad example, or something that does not pass the face validity test, is if I say that people who can balance better on a balance beam or can walk across a balance beam faster are more intelligent. We know that intelligence and balance are not really related to each other. And so my assessment of walking across a balance beam to signal intelligence is not valid. A better term or better use of face validity would be this AP Psych test that you're going to take. So that one does have face validity because it does actually measure things that are relevant to psychology. There you go. But what I want to caution you guys with is just because something has face validity doesn't mean that it's actually valid. This is like the most basic form of validity. It's like the lowest bar. does not say that the test actually measures that construct, just that it appears to. It's pretty easy to meet face validity. So I want you guys now to take a couple of minutes to go back and record in that rightmost column of your packet some sort of mnemonic or example or rhyme or something you can use to remember those 3 terms. Okay. If you guys want more practice with the types of validity and reliability, I've included a link to a pretty cool Quizlet in the packet. We don't really have time to formally go over them right now. We will have a couple more kind of touch points with different research methods and how you can increase validity and reliability later on. But for now, it's just kind of on your own. Use this Quizlet review as necessary. Okay, so we're going to transition to our first and only actual activity of today. We are going to be responding to a research-based FRQ. So first thing I want you guys to do is to set up a timer for 25 minutes. That 25 minutes should be used to both read and respond to the prompt. When you come back, we're going to go over the answers. Please make sure that you are changing your font color to red when you are making your corrections. It's important for me to understand where our touch points are. Use SOTA formatting. If you don't remember a term, first thing is just try your best. And if you seriously just have no idea, go ahead and leave it blank. So I'm going to have you guys do that. I'll see you back in 25 minutes to go over some answers. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully that research-based FRQ was nice and easy for you guys. I'm actually going to go through and read the prompt just so I can kind of call out some keywords that I paid attention to that help me answer the actual questions, all the terms. So researchers are interested in testing how diet impacts reaction time in young adults, and they defined young adults as 21 to 24 years old. Participants were divided into 2 groups. Students with diabetes or celiac disease were excluded upon screening. That means they just weren't included in the study. So then it goes on to talk about the 2 different groups. So group A had a low carb diet, and it's defined as 40 grams of carbs per day or less. And group B was told to follow the typical American diet with 225 grams of carbs per day. The participants followed that diet for a couple of days and then were asked to come into a lab all at the same time and to press a button in their own individual rooms as soon as they heard a tone playing in the testing room. And then they were given $150 for their struggles. So the first question asks you guys, or the first part asks you guys to identify the research method used in the study. It is clearly an experiment. It's defined as experiment. We're not doing correlation research. We're not doing a survey. We are having people come in with 2 distinct testing groups. So you could have said a couple of things. I think the best answer to this question would have been to recognize that there are both control conditions and experimental condition in this setup. Go ahead and take some time if you want to read my response just to make sure and see how it compares to yours. Note that that last sentence right down here is kind of extra. It's always better on these ones to go just a little bit beyond instead of just saying experimentation and leaving it at that. You have to kind of justify your answers. So go ahead, read that if you need more clarification, and take the time to correct your own response to that. Okay, the second term in A, or the second question in A, was to identify one ethically appropriate and one ethically inappropriate aspect of this study. I really only found one real ethically appropriate thing that they did or explicitly said. Remember that for these research questions, you kind of have to take them at face value. Don't invent some random ethical thing that they don't mention that's outside the experimental design. Just take it as it is. They're purposefully leaving things a little bit vague because that serves, in this case, as something ethically inappropriate. So just kind of up to you to kind of piece together what they are looking for. So my ethically appropriate response in this was that they did consider the general welfare of the students. General welfare is kind of one of the ethical requirements for research studies to get approved. And how they demonstrated that was that they excluded students who had a medical condition before they allowed them to participate. So students who have diabetes or celiac disease might actually be harmed by a dramatic change to their diet. So they were excluded, and that is looking after the general welfare of the research participants. Easier one to identify would be the ethically inappropriate aspect. And that one could have been a couple things. I chose lack of debriefing. So remember that debriefing is when they do that kind of like follow-up period after the study concludes, where they, one, make sure that the research participant is like okay and is in basically the same psychological and physical condition as when they entered the study. And they, two, kind of go over the actual study results with the participant to see if they have any sort of questions. You could also have said something about coercion. They didn't mention that they were giving each of the students like $150. If you wanted to say that like that was too much money and it was taking advantage of people, you could definitely have scored for responding with that as well. Again, take the time to go and correct your responses. Okay, question 3 asks you to identify and operationally define the independent variable of the study. Note that usually when we talk about operational definitions, they are in relevance to the dependent variable. You can still operationally define the independent variable as well. So the independent variable of this study is the actual level of carbohydrates that are eaten. There is the regular carb group, and then there is the low carb group. So in this case, the operational definition of low carbohydrate intake is 40 grams of carbs per day, and the operational definition of the average intake is 225 grams of carbs per day. So a lot of people tend to get thrown with, I automatically want to do the dependent variable here, but note that like sometimes it does ask what the independent variable is, and you have to be specific with it. So there we go. 4, how might this procedure be modified to fit the double-blind model? So note that the first thing I did was define the double-blind model. Double-blind model means that neither participants nor researchers know who is assigned to the control or experimental group. And this is where you kind of have a little bit more license to get creative. So I said that in this case, participants are given a pre-made like nutrition smoothie. That's the only thing they eat for a 3-day period. Smoothies will be the same, and they only differ in the carbohydrate value. And so researchers and participants would not be aware at the time of who was assigned each smoothie type. You could kind of go on to say like smoothie type A, which is for the low carb group, only has 40 grams of carbohydrates, and smoothie type B has 225 grams of carbohydrates per day. And that was all they were eating. So that would have been a good way that you could have done a double-blind procedure with this. Not that you necessarily would have needed to as far as like ethics, but why not? Okay. So what is typical with these like FRQ prompts for research design is they're divided up into like part A and B. Usually the first part is around the actual experimental design, and the second part has more to do with like interpreting results. So that kind of follows through here with our part B. So part B, results indicate a statistically significant difference in the participants' response time across the two conditions. Participants in the low carb condition respond to the tone faster with a mean of 1.4 milliseconds and a standard deviation of 0.04 milliseconds than participants in the average carb condition with their mean of 2 milliseconds and a standard deviation of 0.2 milliseconds. So the first part of that question asks to explain like what it means to be statistically significant and what that has to do in the context of this study. Some key things you needed to hit up in this part of the response is you should really have mentioned p-values. So p-value is like a threshold that's set by researchers, and if you exceed the p-value, you have to accept the null hypothesis and say there is no statistically significant relationship. But if that p-value is less than that threshold you set, then you say that yes, there's a very small chance that my data is a statistical fluke and that the trend actually probably means something. Note that most basic psychology research, unless you're doing something in neuroscience, will require a p-value of 5%. So I just kind of went ahead and said, yep, it's less than 5%, we're good. They said already that the results were significant, so I can basically say that the observed trend of low-carb groups responding faster are real, and there's likely some sort of relationship between carb intake and reaction time. Note that I'm not directly flat out saying like this causes this. I'm just saying that so far, based off like my limited experiment, it does support the fact that this is not a statistical fluke, that there might actually be something going on here. Go ahead and correct your part 5 answers if you need to. Okay. 6. So 6 says, what does the mean reveal about the data in this study? So the first thing I do in true SOTA fashion is I'm going to define what the mean is. And I defined it as like the average reaction time in each group. And it's calculated by summing up the scores, adding them together, and then dividing them by the number of participants. And basically in this study, and what they really want you to say beyond that, the application piece, is that the mean for the low carb group was smaller than the mean for the average carb group. That means on average, the low carb group responded to that tone faster. So that's what they're looking for as far as like, what does the mean reveal about this study? Correct your part 6 answers now. Part 7, so this is the last one. Last one says, explain how random selection can be achieved in this study design and why it is essential for the validity of this study. So random selection, like we talked about earlier, is when you create a representative sample using just like completely random, diverse people in your community. So up top is that kind of definition part. And note that I've explained that without random selection, the results would not be generalizable, and therefore you couldn't really apply it to the wider public, and your conclusions are kind of meaningless. The best way, I think, to answer these questions about random selection is through using something like, saying, like a computer generator that randomly sends phone calls or emails to people that meet certain age criteria in a large diverse city, or something like that. Note that if you get a question about random assignment is when you have people from your diverse sample, your generalizable sample, and then you are randomly placing them into either the experimental group or the control group. So remember that random selection happens before you've actually formed the groups, and random assignment is what happens when you actually assign those participants to either the experimental or the control condition. And for either of those, you can say like a random computer generator is probably your best bet for answering those kinds of questions. Okay, so yay, how did it go? If you were in like the 5, 6, 7 range, like you're doing pretty dang good. That's great. If you were in the 3, 4 range, you were on the right path. If you were in the 0, 1, or 2 range, you should probably put in a bit of extra time studying these parts of the FRQ. I am going to tell you guys right now that it looks like the research FRQ is going to be shortened. So in real testing mode, it will probably not have 7 full terms. I would estimate that it would probably have 4 terms. They haven't released specifics on that yet. Just know that of the 2 FRQs, the research-based one is the one that is probably going to be significantly shorter than it would normally be. But I still do think that it's very helpful to kind of go through terms this way, just, you know, because who knows what's going to show up on that test. Yep, that's basically what I just said. I'll update you guys when I get more information. We are placing a call, actually I'm going to call College Board and see if they can release any more information about the FRQs, just because it is such a high stakes moment for you guys. And I'll let you guys know those details as they come out. All right, so that is all for this whole week of AP Psych Distance Learning Review Style. On next week's modules, we have 3 of them. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do an update for the AP test. Like, I will probably have a lot more answers by then as far as like, when is your test? How are you taking it? Etc. Things like that. We're also going to go through some research methods, and then we're going to move on to statistics and ethics. with the like last day probably being a lot more practice with like how you would use statistics, descriptive, and otherwise in an actual AP Psych FRQ. Okay, so changes for next week. I will still be making some of these videos. I will still be making you guys packets, but I do want to acknowledge that College Board is putting a lot of time and energy into developing these like AP Psych live classes. They're actually pretty dang good. I've watched a couple of them in kind of preparation for what we're going to do here, and I do think it's worth us watching those. I mean, I love making video guys for you guys and stuff, but I am going to start, instead of making my own like big long videos, I'm going to have you guys watch the AP Psychology College Board videos. I think it's really good because they're like 100% perfectly aligned. They have like CFUs and practice FRQs and such like that. Note that I'm probably going to be doing some modifications on the video, so I might ask you guys to like play the first 5 minutes of the video and then respond here. And also, in case they ever assign any like homework, don't do that as homework. I will have a time for you guys in that lesson itself to work on that, or as the do now the next day. One of the things we're kind of committed to doing with this e-learning thing is that we're not going to assign homework outside of the normal 60 minutes. So don't expect to like do something for homework beyond this 60 minutes. Yep. Like I said before, I'm going to make some packets that correspond to the College Board videos. So it's going to be like more fill in the blank stuff. If you guys like absolutely hate it, I will have a spot in the bottom of your packet for like feedback and stuff like that. We do want to make sure this works for you guys and that you're getting kind of the support you need. And if watching that video lecture is just like driving a lot of you guys crazy, we will find something else to do. And with that, I'm going to have you guys navigate to Edulastic, and I want you to take the mastery check for distance learning day 2. It should be assigned to you guys. Remember, that's kind of how we're tracking data, so definitely do that. And don't forget to ask me any questions in our psychology office hours time, which is, let's see, anytime between 10:50 and 11:50. You can go ahead and ask me any questions. I will be at my laptop. Thank you guys so much for being so flexible, and I will see you next week.